Here's a video on the second part of the Revolutionary War. So we ended before with Washington's victory at Trenton, his surprise attack on the British and the Hessian soldiers. So today we're going to look at the turning point of the war and the end of the war itself. And there will be a little bit of a video in here from the Revolutionary documentary. So we look at the turning point of the war. It's Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga. The people we have here that are the main characters on the left is Johnny Burgoyne. They called him Gentleman Johnny, the British soldier, the British general. And on the right is Horatio Gates, sometimes called Granny Gates because of his old age, his gray hair, and his these little glasses that he would wear. These are the main soldiers in charge of the generals in charge of the armies. But the real hero of this is Benedict Arnold. I know, gasp! How could Benedict Arnold, the famous traitor of the American Revolution, be a hero in the war? In this battle, Benedict Arnold, this is the kind of the beginning of his maybe we look back his eventual betrayal of the country. He is the mastermind behind this victory. Leading up to this, Benedict Arnold is often overlooked for promotion because he doesn't have the right political connections. He's not very well liked. He's not, he's kind of a hothead. So people often overlooked him. And in this battle, he actually comes up with a plan to save the army. And he disagrees with Gates on it. So Gates punishes him and tells him to sit in his tent and not fight. And Benedict Arnold eventually fights anyway, leaves his tent, and as a reward and when he does that, he ends up saving the American forces at Saratoga. And his reward for that was to get wounded. He gets shot in the leg, and his horse falls on him and crushes his leg, and he walks forever with a limp. And he gets court-martialed. He gets sent to military, court to answer for disobeying orders. So maybe this is part of the reason why Benedict Arnold eventually becomes a traitor, or at least one of the small pieces to it. But anyway, we're not going to talk too much about the actual battle itself, but to give you a sense of why this is important geographically, here's the Battle of Saratoga happens in the state of New York. So there's New York there, if you're not familiar with it, if you're geographically challenged. And the idea behind it, this is the plan of Johnny Burgoyne. And his plan is to separate New England from the rest of the colonies because New England is where all the hotheads of the Revolution were. New England had Sam Adams, John Adams. This is where the Stampback riots were, the Boston Massacre. They figure that if they could separate New England from the rest of the colonies, then the rest of the colonies may not be as interested in this war as New England was, and maybe they can settle a peace with New York and the southern colonies. So Johnny Burgoyne's plan is to march south from Canada and meet General Howe marching north from Philadelphia together, and they'd meet in the middle. They'd separate the colonies, and then they'd be able to deliver this decisive victory. However, the problem is that General Howe doesn't march north. He never leaves Philadelphia or the area of Pennsylvania. He wants to stay and fight and find Washington. If he can defeat Washington, that would be great for his reputation. He doesn't really want to submit to Burgoyne's plan because Burgoyne would get all the glory. And Howe maybe even thinks in Philadelphia if he can capture the Continental Congress, and that would be even better for him. So he never goes north, but who does go north? America. So Burgoyne marches south expecting to find General Howe in support, and instead he runs into Gates and Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen and the American forces that seek to defeat him. And we won't go into the details of the battle, but the Americans win a decisive victory, capture, either kill, wound, or capture Burgoyne's entire army. So there's thousands of British troops out of commission. And here's a painting showing the victory at Saratoga. In the middle is General Gates in the blue coat and the Continental coat, accepting the sword of Burgoyne on the left, who is in the British coat, in the red British coat. So he's a hero of, Gates is a hero of Saratoga, but somewhat falsely, Benedict Arnold really was, but all the correspondence he sends to Congress is going to say how he saved the day and Benedict Arnold disobeyed orders. But either way, this is an important battle, not so much because of the tactics of the battle and the heroes and the villains in the battle, but because this is the turning point in the war. This is the battle that America needed to convince the French to make an alliance with them. The French had been interested in helping the Americans, but they were always a little bit wary of getting involved in another war in North America because they had lost a bunch of other wars. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, the French and Indian War. They weren't really interested in engaging in another war in North America unless they were pretty confident they could win it. And to get that confidence, to make that alliance with America, they had to see that we could win battles on our own, that it wouldn't just be the French fighting for us in North America. And Saratoga is a first major victory that allows us to do that. Benjamin Franklin had been in France all this time, working diligently to try to solidify an alliance. And when word of this victory comes back, the French agree to make an alliance with the Americans. We signed a treaty with them that says we'll be their allies and friends in perpetuity for like essentially forever, and that we would aid them after the war in any conflicts they had, and that during the war the French would supply us with money, with weapons, more importantly with soldiers, and probably most importantly with their navy. Now the French navy wasn't the same as the British navy; it wasn't as powerful. But I think at this point, the British were fighting the Americans, and they could send their full force of the Navy or the bulk of their force of the Navy to North America to blockade our port, to stop trade. The French, really, probably the biggest thing that the French alliance does for the Americans is not so much that troops come to America to fight, whether the British, the Navy does, has any big major naval battles off the coast of America, but they make this a world war. The French attack British interests in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. So now the British have to spread their navy across the whole world. They can't just be looking at what's going on in North America, and maybe even more importantly in the Caribbean, where all the islands were for trade. So the French alliance, huge, and Saratoga is a turning point. After this is kind of like looking back. We know this is a big point where it seems to be, although there's still American losses, that the war starts to go in our favor. If we look at the war moving south, the British, after losing Saratoga, they weren't able to take Boston. Although they won the Battle of New York, it seems like they're facing all kinds of opposition in the north. The population's not terribly receptive to them. They're having a hard time supplying their troops and their army, so they decide to move south where the population is more spread apart. They know there's a lot of loyalist support in some of the southern cities, and in the backcountry, there's a lot of, there are people that really weren't interested one way or the other in the war, that they figure that, they'll go with the British, or the British seem to be winning. So they have a southern strategy, and they send Cornwallis down to the south to attack the Americans. And we're only going to look at a little bit of this, and we'll leave a lot of it for the video. But the British first attack in Savannah, December 29th in 1778, how dare they? 4 days after Christmas, but it's not really an attack. Savannah doesn't put up much of an opposition. The British occupy Savannah. But then 1780, you see in May 1780, they move on Charlestown, right? Charleston today. And Benjamin Lincoln is the American soldier in charge, the American general in charge of Charlestown. And he surrenders after the British lays a siege to them without firing a shot. Something like 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers, Continentals, given up as prisoners of war, without even really putting up a resistance. It's a major loss for the Americans. And it's followed up later that summer in August at the Battle of Camden, which is another disaster for the Americans. Horatio Gates was sent down south after he was the fake winner, the fake hero of Saratoga. He gets sent down south, and he faces Cornwallis in a disastrous battle where he lines up his soldiers in European-style fighting rather than fighting guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run attacks and using the land for his advantage. He faces the British in open field, and he gets the army gets annihilated. Thousands of soldiers are captured, wounded or killed. Gates, being the fake hero that he was, flees. He leaves his army in the field to be captured. He rides away on his horse for hours and miles away. His aides, they say, had to chase him down. He was riding so fast to get away without being captured, and he gets almost revealed for the coward that he was and not the great leader that he was. So the beginning of the war in the South is a disaster for the Americans with some major losses. But Washington's going to turn it around in 1781 because he's going to appoint, let's see, where is he? Nathaniel Greene, one of the best generals that the Americans had. They'll go down there and take over the army, and he's going to have different tactics for fighting the British and Cornwallis. We'll see that in the video. So Nathaniel Greene, the general in charge of the South, the Southern campaign, and Daniel Morgan, the Morgan's riflemen, these people that have been very influential in the Battle of Saratoga. Now they're going to move south, and Daniel Morgan's going to be another person who's going to hit between Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan. They're going to redefine how war is fought in the South. So they're going to change the tactics and defeat drag out the war and defeat the British. And we'll see that in the video. So some of the questions for you to answer, these are on the assignment sheet also. And again, I'm not collecting these. There's not a Google Doc to fill out. This is just what I want you to know from watching the video. So use these to guide your notes when watching the segment of the video. What is Greene's unconventional approach to the battle, and why does it have the potential to be successful? Describe Daniel Morgan's tactics at Cowpens. Why were they necessary? What were Greene's tactics when faced with the relentless Cornwallis and his troops? Why were they necessary if the Continentals were to win? Why did Greene seek confrontation with Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse? What was the outcome? Why was victory ambiguous? And then what was the public opinion back in England? So when you're thinking about this, we'll see this a little bit in this lecture also. Why did the British decide to end the war? So what was the public opinion like back at home? How is this reflected by the commanders in America? And then last, how did Sir Henry Clinton's inactivity influence the events at Yorktown? That's a battle where the British eventually surrendered. This is a battle to end the war. What was Cornwallis's error of judgment, and how did Washington take advantage? So those are things I want you to look for in the video. So, and then after the video, though, we'll just tie this up with the Treaty of Paris.
The defeats at Camden and Waxhaws have decimated the Continental Southern divisions. Of the 3,000 troops who marched at Camden, over half have been killed, captured, or wounded. The majority of the Patriot militia simply disappear back into the wilds. The South has all but fallen to the British. In New Jersey, George Washington soon receives news of the defeat at Camden. Washington feared the worst when Congress appointed Horatio Gates, and the worst has happened. Gates will face court-martial. But there is a more urgent concern. Who will now lead Washington's Southern Army?
It's after Gates's debacle at Camden that Washington is finally allowed to send the man he wants. And of course, he goes to Major General Nathaniel Greene.
I can venture to introduce this gentleman to you as a man of abilities, bravery, and coolness. George Washington.
Nathaniel Greene is Washington's most trusted subordinate. A New England patriot and fallen Quaker, Greene has proven time and time again to be one of the most brilliant commanders in the Continental Army.
Truly one of America's great generals, and nobody knows who he is. Washington says, if I'm shot in battle, if I can no longer take command, the general I want to lead is Nathaniel Greene.
Among the many qualities that recommended Nathaniel Greene to George Washington was his can-do attitude. All military commanders want subordinates that will never admit defeat, that always say they can find some way to accomplish the mission.
Greene will travel far from his native New England to take on this formidable command, only to find an army ravaged and dispirited.
I am removed from almost all my friends and connections and have to prosecute a war with almost insurmountable difficulties. I cannot contemplate my own situation without the greatest degree of anxiety. Nathaniel Greene, Continental General.
Only 800 are deemed fit for duty. The rest, Greene reports, are literally naked, starving with cold and hunger. In letter after letter, Greene beseeches the 13 colonies for supplies and troops, to no effect. He begins to fear mutiny.
It is impracticable to preserve discipline when troops are in want of everything. Be assured that you raise men in vain unless you clothe, arm, and equip them properly for the field. Nathaniel Greene.
Greene and the Southern Army have all but been abandoned. He will attempt to supply his troops through local sources. But there is a threat more urgent than starvation. Cornwallis is on the march. Greene needs a strategy and a miracle to keep his army from total destruction. The fortune Greene needs soon arrives in the form of Colonel Daniel Morgan, one of the most courageous and unusual officers the Americans have. Morgan's past is cloaked in mystery, and he never speaks of it. By age 17, he appears as part of the British Army during the French and Indian War. By then, he is already a rough and scrappy boy, hardened from a backwoods frontier life. By nature, he is a fighter and carries scars from every brawl and knockdown, including 500 lashes for punching his superior officer in his early days. From then on, Morgan becomes the stuff of Patriot legend.
He really is a roughneck frontiersman. Vulgar, hard-drinking, hard-fighting man. He really is the sort of stuff of fiction.
But his rise through the ranks of the Continental Army is fact, a result of his enormous talent.
Daniel Morgan would never have been made a general in the British Army. Morgan moves ahead because of ability. And he's a great example of the coming meritocracy. You don't have to be born into the gentry to be an officer. If you have the ability, if you have the stick-to-itness.
By the time Morgan reaches the South, his hard-earned reputation and his role at major battles like Saratoga gains him the respect of patriots and the resentment of the enemy. No one is better suited to fighting in the rough southern lands than Morgan. With Morgan now at his side, Greene will enact one of the boldest and most irregular moves of the war. Greene will split his army.
Nathanael Greene adopts what it might be considered an unconventional approach to this war. He's going to break his force. He's going to divide it into something of flying columns, very mobile columns.
He knows the British Army doesn't know the territory. And he knows that since they want to draw him into a decisive battle, he can lead them through the backwoods, through the marshes, into what are ultimately indecisive conflicts that's going to spread the British Army thin.
Greene and Morgan take off on separate paths. Greene to the southeast, Morgan to the southwest. As if on cue, Cornwallis too splits his army, sending the infamous Tarleton after Morgan, while he himself pursues Greene. The four flying armies, the prey and the predators, move through some of the roughest terrain on the eastern seaboard, each following their own will to win. Cornwallis, Greene, Tarleton, and Morgan, four ambitious and gifted leaders now engaged in a headlong chase. On the fringes of their armies, they skirmish, confirming over and over again the proximity of each other's troops. Yet Greene and Morgan, with their lighter armies, move faster, avoiding a major battle. Instead, they draw the British deeper into the backcountry, further from supply lines and reinforcements. General Cornwallis, the British commander, grows more frustrated with each mile of rough terrain. The farther Greene goes, the more intent Cornwallis becomes on catching him.
He is going to chase Nathanael Greene all around the Carolinas, trying to gain that decisive battle. Greene, knowing better than to engage Cornwallis on Cornwallis's terms, is not going to let Cornwallis catch up to him. As close as Cornwallis gets, Greene is always able to stay one small step ahead of him.
Be a little careful and tread softly, for depend on it, you have a modern Hannibal to deal with in the person of Cornwallis.
Daniel Morgan has his own nemesis to contend with, Banastre Tarleton and his ferocious regiment. Morgan knows he can't outrun them for long. January 16th, South Carolina. Daniel Morgan can no longer avoid confronting Tarleton's forces. Now, he must prepare to fight. On the eve of their battle, Morgan visits with his troops. Out of 600 men, more than half are militia. The same untrained forces that were last seen fleeing the field at Camden. Morgan's challenge? Make them engage. As he faces the most grueling battle of his life, Morgan rallies these citizen soldiers.
Just hold up your head, boys. And when you return to your homes, how the old folks will bless you for your gallant conduct. Daniel Morgan.
Morgan has great rapport with his troops. He loves to joke with them, to talk with them. I think they really just find him one of the great officers they've ever served under. He tells them things like, "We'll have you home soon, boys, to kiss your girlfriends."
January 17th. On a mild winter morning, the battle takes shape on a field known as Cowpens. Here, Morgan puts into play his own new strategy, one of the most inventive of the war, and most timely.
Up to that point in the war, nobody had figured out how to use militia in a formal battle because they weren't trained to meet British regulars in a formal engagement. Morgan, he figures it out.
Like others before him, Morgan puts his militia out front, the first line to meet Tarleton's charging British soldiers. Only this time, he tells them to fire just 2 shots, a quick volley, and then fall back. Against the onslaught of the British charge, they do just that.
When the British see this, they think that they have earned a replay of Camden, that they have essentially caused a rout of the militia forces who are breaking from the field. They will pursue a headlong rush and find themselves facing the very well-directed volley fires of Morgan's regulars. The result is predictable for Tarleton's Legion.
Bannister Tarleton, the aggressive and ambitious young officer, drives right into Morgan's trap. The Continentals reply with alarming force. British infantry scatter and retreat. Tarleton will try to push them on again, but within an hour, the battle is lost. Tarleton has chased Morgan all across the South to end here, defeated by the rough and tumble American at Cowpens.
Talk about a conflict of styles. You have this very sort of arrogant, dashing, cruel British officer, young guy, and Daniel Morgan, and they're both playing for keeps, you know? How can you not love that victory when Daniel Morgan just beats the tar out of Tarleton?
Most of the entire British detachment at Cowpens is killed, captured, or wounded. This time, it is bloody Bannister Tarleton who is seen fleeing the field. He will escape, soon to rejoin Cornwallis's army, thirsting for revenge. It was Morgan's win. Morgan had outplanned, outstrategized, and outled his counterpart. He had transformed his militia army at their moment of greatest need. But it will be the backcountry brawlers' last battle. Morgan, all along, suffered quietly from painful back ailments and rheumatism.
Say, why is he retiring now? He's just won this big, monumental victory. And the real question is, how was he able to fight at all during the Battle of Cowpens? It's very painful for him And his commanding officer, Nathaniel Greene, says, "You've earned the right to go home."
Morgan, who had spent a lifetime of fighting, will now watch the war from a small farm in Virginia, from the sidelines. For Nathaniel Greene, the chase is still on. Cornwallis is closing in, and with Tarleton again by his side, they will come at Greene with everything they've got. The war in the South will go on, as bloody and vicious as ever, but the stakes are rising. From the South to the North to across the Atlantic Ocean, everyone is asking the same question. How will this war end? And when? For everyone, time is running out on the American Revolution. In the South, the war continues without pause, an ongoing showdown between two determined armies. Having surprisingly beaten the British at the Battle of Cowpen, the Continentals steady themselves for revenge. The British will seek to make an all-or-nothing push to annihilate the rebel force. General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander in the South, has become singular in his obsession. He will not stop until he can make the Continental Army stand and fight. Instead, the rebels keep pulling Cornwallis deeper into the backcountry. On a cat-and-mouse chase led by his arch-rival, General Nathaniel Greene.
Cornwallis himself believes that if he can draw Nathaniel Greene into one decisive fight, if he can bring this war to one pitched battle somewhere in the South, the battle's going to be over. Greene won't give him that satisfaction.
General Nathaniel Greene knows better. He learned early on in battles like New York and Brandywine that keeping the army away from direct confrontation is paramount. Like a boxer who realizes his opponent hits harder, Greene's plan is to keep moving, to wear down and exhaust his enemy. If he can buy time, he can get reinforcements. Greene draws Cornwallis step by step farther from his lines of supply, farther from the possibility of reinforcements, farther from the point of no return. Greene has been leading a chase for months that zigzags across the South. Through swamp and forest, Cornwallis manages to stay close, often trailing by a few hundred yards. But the Continentals are like a mirage that disappears as he draws near. The two sides regularly skirmish amongst scouting parties. But the main armies never meet. Greene's Continental force is smaller, lighter, and faster. The British, by contrast, are encumbered. They will need to take extreme measures to keep up. To lighten his load, Cornwallis orders an enormous bonfire built, onto which all the unnecessary trappings of a distinguished British army are thrown. Wagons, tents, clothing, fine china, silver, and cask upon cask of rum.
Cornwallis is very earnest. He does not want to allow Greene to escape. He is going to do anything within his power to catch up to Greene.
In this situation, without baggage, necessaries, with zeal and bayonets only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara.
It is a fateful decision that he will pay for later. The race picks up speed. The two armies begin to travel at an almost inhuman pace, moving as much as 40 miles in a single day. Greene now sees only one chance for survival. As Cornwallis chases him toward the Virginia border, Greene makes a daring move. He splits his army, sending one branch toward the upper Dan River, while the main army moves east, where Greene has commandeered all the boats along the crossings. Cornwallis, fooled, dutifully follows the decoy.
It bought Greene the time he needed to move down the river to the point where the Continentals had gathered all of the boats on that river and crossed at a point that Cornwallis could not hope to cross.
Greene's plan works. He moves his entire regiment, all 2,000 men, across the Dan, reaching the other side just in time. The British, realizing the ploy, rush to the crossing, arriving just hours after the last of Greene's boats leave. Cornwallis, so close to the victory he sought, recognizes that the chase is over. The cheers from the Continentals are so loud they can be heard across the river, a taunting sound to the British. But it is genuine joy. After marching more than 200 miles in just 1 month, Greene's army can finally rest. Greene will not stay in Virginia long. He will get what he needs, new supplies and new recruits, and change his game. The hunted will become the hunter. Here in the South and beyond, the tide is about to turn. February 22nd, 1781. General Nathanael Greene pushes his players into position. He readies his army, now regrouped and resupplied, to cross back into North Carolina, where he will now seek the confrontation with Cornwallis he once avoided. Crossing again over the Dan River, Greene soon draws Cornwallis back into the chase. Only this time, Greene leads the desperate British commander toward a spot favorable to the Continentals. They will take the high ground at a small junction called Guilford Courthouse. March 15th. Greene sets his army first. Cornwallis, weakened from lack of provisions, nonetheless prepares to throw all he has left at winning. Cornwallis's men soon break through Greene's militia lines. They bear down on the rest of the army with bayonets. The Continentals face the charge. The two sides fall upon each other at close quarters. A bloody melee fought hand to hand. Fearing loss, Cornwallis makes a desperate and brutal decision.
Cornwallis turns to the lieutenant in charge of artillery and orders him to fire grape right into the mass of struggling men, both Americans and British, in order to break it up.
The cannon cut down as many British as Americans. But it is enough to stop the rebels. Greene orders his men to retreat. He cannot and will not risk his soldiers. Cornwallis is victorious, but only by sacrificing his own men. Twice as many British die in the victory as Continentals perish in the loss. It is the kind of win that feels, ultimately, more like a defeat. The months spent chasing Greene have cost Cornwallis greatly and gained him nothing. Defeat of the rebel army is not 1 inch closer to him. He will leave the Carolinas an ambiguous victor in search of more decisive battles. But he leaves the British strategy in tatters, just at the moment the Continentals and their French allies are about to move as one. Losses in the south and stalemate in the north have left the British command in America in disarray. Worse, public confidence back home is weakening. London, England, 1781. All of Britain is tiring of this increasingly unpopular conflagration, whose costs in money and human life continue to escalate. King George and his cabinet may try to spin it differently, but they cannot change the facts. The insurgent colonies are showing no signs of submission.
The British people are saying, come on home. What's in this for us? They're wondering, how is this going to end? How is this going to play out? Or is this just going to go on forever?
The rift between those who wish to end the war fast and those who take the long view travels over the Atlantic. In America, the King's commanders will soon find themselves with opposing strategies of war. In New York, Sir Henry Clinton, the overall British commander, takes a patient view of things. It's easy for him, surrounded as he is by all the luxuries the colonies have to offer.
Clinton has 4 houses that he lives in New York. He's living pretty high on the hog, well supplied. Certainly his liquor bill is remarkably high. Found great enjoyment in the arms of Mrs. Badley, who was the wife of a British officer. I would guess it was hard for Clinton to leave New York. It was comfortable, it was loving, at least Mrs. Badley was.
The way Clinton conducts the war from New York, it's almost like he's waiting for events to throw him an advantage that he can then act upon. Cornwallis's instincts are to act. Cornwallis's instincts are to fight them to death.
Now, my dear friend, what is our plan? Without one, we cannot succeed. If we mean an offensive war in America, we must abandon New York and bring our whole force into Virginia. General Charles Cornwallis.
Cornwallis pushes his contest into Virginia, but he is soon cut short. Clinton, opting for defensive wars, orders him to set up a protective base along the coast.
This adventure through the South, inland, is not working. We need to make sure that we secure the kinds of bases, the footholds that will allow us to maintain our position in North America and fight another day.
Cornwallis has no choice but to obey his commander. He turns his army toward a small coastal village, to a place called Yorktown. Once, Yorktown was known solely as a tobacco trading port, but it will soon become a major battlefield, and for some, a place of destiny. July, the Caribbean. France's Admiral de Grasse makes his long-awaited appearance.
The fall is hurricane season in the Americas. This is a time when, for the most part, shipping comes to a complete pause in the Caribbean. And so it's the right moment for de Grasse to leave the Caribbean and assist their allies in North America.
I am sorry to see the distress in which the American continent finds itself. You can note the desire I have to provoke a change in your favor of the situation. Admiral de Grasse.
The French Navy, thus far an absent player in the Revolution, now turns north with 28 ships, 3,000 men, and long-awaited money to pay Continental soldiers. But they also come with a catch. It will be the French, not Washington, who decide where they will land. In their view, the British are weakest in Virginia, near the Chesapeake Bay, at the small port of Yorktown.
Washington had his heart set on retaking New York, but when DeGrasse says he's going to the Chesapeake, he's going to be there just for a certain time, Washington then makes really the greatest decision of his career. He knows, he seems to sense that this is the time. This is the time to strike.
It may be declared in a word that we are at the end of our tether, and that now or never our deliverance must come. George Washington.
With all he has, every soldier, every cannon, every French reinforcement, Washington moves south. The general now returns to Virginia, his beloved homeland. In search of the battle he hopes will end the war. A convergence is taking shape. As Admiral DeGrasse sails up toward Virginia from the Caribbean, the Continental Army, now joined by 5,000 French troops, also heads toward the Chesapeake Bay. There, General Cornwallis hastens to build his defenses at Yorktown. But he is beginning to feel that he is sitting at the center of a dangerous trap. Cornwallis raises the alarm. He writes to Clinton in New York.
Sir, if I had no hopes of relief, I would rather risk an action than defend my half-finished defenses. But if you cannot relieve me very soon, you must be prepared to hear the worst. General Charles Cornwallis.
Clinton's response? Vague promises.
Your lordship may be assured I shall endeavor to reinforce the army under your command by all the means within my power. Sir Henry Clinton.
Cornwallis will soon find himself hanging on those promises, while Washington and the French will get their chance to fulfill the promise of alliance. For each player, the war's endgame has arrived. The Continental Army, after a year of deadlock and disloyalty, is now moving as one en route to Yorktown and the largest offensive of the war. America, fatigued after 6 years of fighting, holds its breath. Independence, their glorious cause, feels within its grasp once more. September 5th. Admiral DeGrasse and his French fleet arrive first to the Chesapeake Bay and take on the inadequate British force sent to chase him out. The two navies clash at sea for 4 days. Both fleets are badly hurt, but it is the British who must give up the bay.
They needed to drive DeGrasse out of the mouth of the Chesapeake, and that they failed to do.
DeGrasse, in one pivotal battle, captures control of all that comes into or out of Yorktown. General Cornwallis knows his situation is worsening. He needs more help. He needs reinforcements. His commander, Henry Clinton, has not budged from New York.
Sir Henry Clinton to Earl Cornwallis, New York. Your lordship may be assured that I am doing everything in my power to relieve you, if the winds permit and no unforeseen accident happen. This, however, is subject to disappointment. Sir Henry Clinton.
Earl Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, I shall have no doubt, if relief arrives in any reasonable time, York will be in the possession of His Majesty's troops. General Charles Cornwallis.
Cornwallis, feeling magnanimous, takes faith in Clinton's tepid promises. Imprudently, he stays put. One by one, his routes of escape are cut off. De Grasse's ships inch up the York River. George Washington takes the south. French ground troops occupy the north and west. 17,000 French and Continental soldiers now surround Cornwallis. Washington presents his plan: launch a massive frontal assault on Cornwallis. His European allies disagree.
Yorktown has now become heavily fortified. Washington will lose a lot of men in the assault. General Rochambeau, the French commander, suggests a long-range siege of cannon and mortar. Washington sees it as a better strategy. One of his great gifts as a commander was to listen to other people and often do what other people suggested, even if he was against it at first.
On October 6th, the siege begins. Trenches are dug that will, in time, envelop Yorktown, like the tightening of a noose.
Earl Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, the enemy made their first parallel on the night of the 6th. On the evening of the 9th, their batteries opened, and have since continued firing without intermission. Against so powerful an attack, we cannot hope to make a very long resistance. General Charles Cornwallis.
A lot of a siege is about the timing. Can you force a city to surrender before the city gets reinforcements? Can you get closer and closer in your parallel trenches as you move towards the city line of defenses?
October 11th, the second parallel is dug, closing the circle around Yorktown. Still, there is no sign of Clinton's reinforcements.
October 11th, 5 p.m. Since my last letter was written, we have lost 30 men. I have only to repeat, nothing but a direct move can save me. General Charles Cornwallis.
Clinton promises support, and Clinton promises support, and Clinton promises support, and Cornwallis waits for the support, and he waits for the support, and it doesn't arrive.
The siege daily is becoming more and more formidable. His Lordship Cornwallis must view his situation as extremely critical, if not desperate. James Thatcher, American officer.
October 14th, 8 p.m. Washington's troops close in and make a full-scale attack on the outer redoubts of the fort.
October 15th, Earl Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, my situation now becomes very critical. The safety of this place is so precarious that I cannot recommend you run great risk in endeavoring to save us. General Charles Cornwallis.
Cornwallis's letter will not be read. Clinton has already set sail from New York. But the belated relief effort will not be in time. His window has closed. For 6 long years, Washington fought a war marked more by loss than victory. Now his day has come. The general's finest hour begins quietly with a lone British drummer spotted coming through the smoke.
The enemy beat a parley, and Lord Cornwallis proposed a cessation of hostilities to settle terms for the surrender of the posts. To this he was answered that a desire to spare the further effusion of blood would readily incline me to accept of the surrender, but that I wished to have it in writing. George Washington.
When he got Cornwallis's letter proposing the cessation of hostilities, And his heart must have been ready to burst. Because I think he must have known, just as Cornwallis knew, that was it. This was the end.
To Sir Henry Clinton. Sir, I have the mortification to inform your Excellency that I have been forced to surrender the troops under my command. I never saw this post in a very favorable light. General Charles Cornwallis.
General Henry Clinton can barely contemplate the consequences of his inaction. He had set in motion the endgame, and then sat idly while it played out. Now the Southern British Army is lost, and possibly the war itself. October 19th, 1781. "7,000 redcoats lay down their arms in front of General George Washington. On this momentous occasion, only one person is missing. General Charles Cornwallis avoids the ceremony, claiming illness. No doubt he felt worse on this day than any other in his long military career.
How could this have happened? Cornwallis is so humiliated and so stricken by the defeat that he cannot surrender in person to George Washington.
October 27th. Cornwallis and Washington will meet a week later when Cornwallis, in a show of respect, invites Washington to his headquarters. What the two men discuss is not recorded. But surely they must have shared the same thought. Now they come together as equals, as the commanders from two nations. One ancient and powerful, the other on the verge of being born.
For the Americans, certainly there are euphoric feelings of victory. Now, though, the more difficult task of building a nation begins.
All right, so after the Battle of Yorktown, the British are more willing to come in and discuss the terms of the surrender, and we know that the pressure from the video, they talk about this too, a lot of the pressure to end the war came from British merchants. We like to think that Americans won it by the battles and stuff, and those certainly had a big part to do with it, the French alliance, but a lot of the pressure to end the war came from the British people themselves. The British people were tired of paying taxes. They had to pay for this war, and they wanted things to go back to the way they were. The average British citizen didn't really care if Americans were independent. There wasn't something that issues about sovereignty and parliament. They didn't really care about that with the Americans. And the other pressure came from the British merchants, who were losing money hand over fist during this. They were still owed money from before the war by Americans who were trading with them, that bought things on credit, and then they didn't trade at all with America during the war, and they were the number one trade partner. So the British merchants put tons of pressure upon Parliament to end this war. So eventually, they settle for peace after Yorktown. And about a year and a half after Yorktown, they agree on the Treaty of Paris. And you see this painting here of the main people negotiating it, John Adams, which is he's kind of in the bottom right. That's it's an unfinished painting, but you see him in the bottom right. Benjamin Franklin and John Jay were the main negotiators of this treaty. And they, the terms of the treaty themselves, are the British, they're going to recognize America as an independent and sovereign nation, meaning that a country of their own, no longer part of the British Empire. So that's the main thing we were fighting for. The obvious thing we're going to get is independence. Territorial gains. The British, you see in this map, they're going to give us everything from east of the Mississippi to the coast, not Canada. So Canada will stay part of the British Empire. Spain gets Florida, because Spain, if you remember, Florida used to belong to British after the French and Indian War. And since the Spanish were also aiding the United States along with the French, what did they get? We're going to give them Florida as kind of compensation for their aid and other factors. We promised we'd help them out in Europe, and we don't help them out in Europe, so we give them Florida instead. So we see Spain controls Louisiana and Florida. the British and Canada, but the United States more than doubles the size of its country with this treaty. All the land east of the Mississippi will become the United States. We're going to get Americans are going to be guaranteed fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. That's important. You might think, oh, so what's the big deal? But that was probably one of the bigger parts of this treaty. There's a massive fishing industry in America, and the great fishing grounds are off the coast of Newfoundland and Canada. And if we're no longer part of the British Empire and Canada is part of the British Empire, there's concern that they won't let us fish off the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland. So the British agree to let us continue fishing there. Americans promised to honor pre-war debts to British merchants. That was a big thing for the merchants. That they were owed money, rightfully so, money that we had owed them because we bought things on credit before the war, before any of this revolution happened. And Americans have to make a promise to repay those debts from before the war. We'll see later on they don't for the most part, but we make the promise to settle the treaty that we would. Americans also somewhat promised to return confiscated property to loyalists. So Continental Congress, they said they would highly recommend or strongly recommended states return any property taken from loyalists by militia and patriots and give it back to them. So we make this promise, and again, this is something that we Americans don't do a great job of following through on. They do a little bit. There's a lot of loyalists who don't get their property back, and loyalists we'll see in one of the sections coming up that will, later assignment. They're one of the biggest losers of this war. They don't get their property back in a lot of cases. They're treated as suspicious and traitors in America. They can't go to Britain. When some of them go to Britain, they're looked down upon there. But either way, we promised we would return confiscated property after the war to the loyalists if it was taken away by militias and patriots. And that ends the terms of the Treaty of Paris, and that ends the American Revolution. So you have a quiz coming up on this stuff, and then from that point on, we'll start looking at how America affected society in positive and negative ways.